Hi friends, in this video I'm going to share with you my method for making homemade sourdough bread, and here you can see my starter that has been sitting in the fridge for a little while, for probably about a month, and it developed a layer of what they call hooch on the top, which is that kind of brown liquid, and that does not mean that your starter is dead. It just means that it's really hungry and it needs to be fed. So to start this batch of sourdough, I poured off the hooch and I'm going to refresh my sourdough starter. And so here I have a clean mason jar, and so I'm putting in some of that, I guess I would call it dormant sourdough starter into the jar. And here typically you'd want to do about 35 grams of starter, but as you can see, I did more than that, and that's okay. In this process, you don't have to be necessarily exact with the numbers. And so typically you would do 35 grams of starter and then 125 grams of room temperature water and then 140 grams of flour. But, I kind of just, when I'm doing this, I just make sure it's about those numbers. I don't worry about it being too exact. And so here I'm adding the flour, and I use just a regular organic, this is a whole grain red wheat flour. And so it's not enriched, so it's literally just the flour, so they don't take anything out or put anything back in. But it is just a basic all-purpose, white flour. And so here it's all mixed in, and this is the fresh starter that's going to sit overnight and start fermenting and bubbling away. And so then the next day, here you can see how much it grew in volume and is really nice and healthy and bubbly. And so I could go ahead and make sourdough bread from this, but I wanted to actually do another feeding and keep it really nice and fresh since it had been sitting in the fridge for so long. So here I am again. I'm doing the exact same thing I did the day before. This time I tried to get a little bit more exact with the numbers. But anyway, and I'm adding the water and then the flour, and it's just the same thing I did yesterday. And then this will sit again overnight, and it'll get nice and bubbly, and then it'll be ready. And then at this point I was pretty much ready to make sourdough with it. And so the next day I used the nice fresh bubbly starter and made my sourdough bread. So here I am I had already taken out 35 grams of this starter and fed it like I had the day before, and I took what was left for making my sourdough bread. And so here I'm adding the water, and it's 600 grams of water to this portion, and then I just whisk it together until the starter is completely dissolved in the water. And the water is a lukewarm temperature. You want it to be lukewarm, not too hot, not too cold. And then to this, I add 200 grams of whole wheat flour, and then 800 grams of the all-purpose flour. Now, you can play with this and you can try to use different flours, and I still haven't experimented much with different flours. This is just the basic one that I learned how to make, which is part whole wheat and part white flour. So anyway, something I definitely want to try to do someday is to play around with it and try some different flours. But for now, this is just how I learned how to make it. And then I just start to mix these in. I start with a wooden spoon and start to mix the flour and the starter together. And then eventually, after it's more mixed together, I will move to using my hands, because that just is a whole heck of a lot easier. And so you just get this all mixed together as much as possible. And then here you'll see in a minute, I'll start to actually use my hands. And it is pretty sticky and messy, but hey, it's making bread, and that's part of the fun of making bread. Your hands are going to get dirty. And so really, honestly, this is the only part of the sourdough process where you're quote unquote kneading the dough. You're not really even really kneading it here. You're just mixing it together. And so I just, mix it together until it's kind of all come together. And like I said, it'll be sticky. And you really just want to make sure that it's all incorporated really, really well. And then this is going to sit covered with a damp cloth for an hour. And then from here, once the hour's up, this is where I'm going to add the salt and then a little bit more water. And so for this, you add 25 grams of salt, and I use the kosher salt. And then you add in 135 grams of, once again, lukewarm water. And here the dough has been resting for an hour. And now I'm going to add in the water and the salt. And like I said, this is just the method that I learned. I've had people say like, I don't do it that way. And I think there's just different methods, but this is the one that I learned. This is how I learned how to make sourdough. So, and it works. So I've stuck with it. So now you're just going to kind of start to kind of mix it all in. And this gets a little bit messy too, for sure. And you just start to, just work it with your hands. And eventually I go to using two hands just to make it quicker, because it does take a little while to get this all incorporated in together. And you just keep working it until it's all incorporated. And then once it's all mixed really well, I'm going to cover it again with the damp tea towel. And it's going to sit and rest for 30 minutes. And this is where the stretching and folding starts. And so something about sourdough bread that when I first started making it, that I had no clue, was that you don't actually knead it. It's not like making a yeasted bread. This is the method right here that you use of stretching and folding, is basically the quote unquote kneading of the bread. And so here you just start to stretch it and fold it. And I do 4 turns. And that's all I'm going to do. And then I'm going to cover it again with the tea towel and let it rest again for another 30 minutes. And I repeat this process 4 times. And you'll see as I repeat this process, the dough will start to get a little bit more tight. It won't be as loose as when I first started the process. And so here I am again. This is the second stretch and fold. This was after 30 minutes. And this is actually probably one of my favorite parts of making sourdough bread, is the stretching and folding. I don't know, there's just something about it that I really enjoy. I guess the sensory part of it, of getting your hands in the dough. And see, even the second stretch and fold, it's already starting to get a little bit more tight. And so then I cover it again and let it sit again for 30 minutes. And now we're stretching and folding again. And see, I have to kind of pull a little bit harder because the dough's getting a little, getting tighter. And so once again, I'm going to cover it and do this one more time. And this will be the fourth and final stretch and fold. So the thing with sourdough is it's not difficult. It's just a very long process. And it's something you kind of have to almost plan ahead. Like I usually have to plan ahead, 2 or 3 days for when I'm going to be making sourdough, because I'll have to refresh my starter. And then of course the actual making of the sourdough bread takes a couple days. And so here, after I've done the stretching and folding, I let it sit for about 8 hours. It's usually typically 4 to 8 hours. You want it to double in size. And so here I am adding a little bit of flour just so it's not going to stick to my fingers as bad. I'm sure there is a much easier method for this. There must be, but I just have not looked it up or anything. So I just try to kind of, cut the dough in half and then, separate it into two parts. And then I just kind of work it a little bit into a nice ball, I guess you could say. And you don't want to work it too much. You don't want to beat out too much of the air or anything. It's just kind of gently getting it into a nice ball. And then I put a tea towel into a bowl and just put the dough right in the bowl. And then here I'm doing the second half. And then sometimes I do mini loaves. And so I will cut this into fourths and do little mini loaves of sourdough. But here I'm just doing two larger loaves. And so I'm just doing the same thing, just kind of doing my best to get it into a nice ball shape. And then I put it in the lined bowl. And then here I just cover with saran wrap. And then I make a kind of I don't know what you call it. I take a big strip of saran wrap and then I just wrap it around the edge and tie it. And I know that there's other ways of doing this as well. I know some people put shower caps. They'll use a shower cap over the bowl, but this is just how I've done it. So anyway, that went into the fridge overnight to proof. So proof overnight in the fridge. And then here I am turning it out onto some parchment paper. And before I did this, I took my cast iron Dutch oven and I put it into my oven and preheated the oven to 475. So that way the Dutch oven is nice and hot and the oven is nice and hot. And so here I put some flour on the dough and I'm going to score. And scoring is really fun too, because you get to kind of be creative and just have fun with it. But the thing about sourdough bread is you can be real careful with your scoring, and there's going to be times when the bread is just it's going to split the way it wants to split in the baking process. There's no guarantee that your scoring is going to end up perfectly every single time. But still, it's really fun, and it's really fun to just see how it's going to turn out. And so here I'm just doing a real simple little design. Pinterest is a great place to go and find ideas for how to score your bread. So here I put it into the piping hot cast iron Dutch oven, and it went into the oven. And here is the finished bread. And this one turned out great. The scoring, I really liked the scoring on this one. So thankfully this one turned out the way I was wanting. But even if your scoring doesn't turn out, the bread is still delicious. So that's a perk. So here's the second loaf. So what I do for baking is I preheat the oven to 475, like I said, and I have the Dutch oven in the oven getting hot. And then you put the dough in the Dutch oven covered with the lid, and you let that bake for at 475 for 30 minutes. And then after 30 minutes, you turn the oven down to 450 degrees and take the lid off. And then you continue to bake it for another 20 minutes. And then it's done. And so here's the second loaf. And I'm doing a different scoring pattern. And you'll see that on this loaf, the scoring didn't quite turn out, how I was expecting it to. You'll see here in a second when I pull it out of the oven. So here, this loaf is going into the oven. And then here you can see that the scoring on the sides did not turn out the way I was wanting. But thankfully, it's still edible and still delicious. So thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you found it helpful. If you are working on making your own sourdough, please subscribe and like this video and share with somebody else that you think would enjoy it. And I will talk to you guys in the next video.